So we're going to sum up what debating means into one simple phrase. Debating is a tool in which you can learn how to build your speech using logical construction and rhetoric. And we think that the best way of showing you how to use these tools is by actually performing a very short debate on stage about the TED Talk that we are actually attending. So, we are going to talk about if these particular conferences have a real impact or not, and we will kindly ask you to follow the particular arguments that we are going to make on the slides, which will be up there. So, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Radu.
Thank you, Octav. Now, I don't necessarily need to prove to you guys the value that TED has in spreading ideas. Presumably, you've already bought into this idea, and that's why you're here. But for the purpose of this exercise, that's what my first speech is going to focus on, and give you a very simple rationale as to why we believe that TED is critical in spreading ideas and why it does so impactfully. So let's start off with what its fundamental mission statement is, right? TED basically stands for this concept of spreading ideas. And in my mind, spreading ideas always comes down to communication. Now, as a second premise to that, think about what communication fundamentally is, and understand and start from the assumption that the three basic concepts of effective communication are the ones that you can see on the slide as well, right? You have a person sending a message, ideally a valuable one, and ideally one that is worth sending. You want to have a channel, and you want to have someone willing to receive that particular message to finalize that communication process. So does TED have, or does TED not have, these particular ones, right? TED has senders. You've seen quite a few speakers, and it has great senders of particularly valuable messages, right? Why we were particularly invited, we're not yet sure. But generally speaking, the people that are standing up here in front of you today have valuable stories to share with you. They have a perfect channel to do that as well. And it's not only because we have the opportunity to speak in front of a full room, but also because, you know, via the power and the magic of Google and of YouTube implicitly, this story will actually carry on even further because of the channels that TED actually offers. Secondly, and lastly, there is a receiver. TED, by its definition, draws in a particularly curious group of people, such as yourself, who are willing to sacrifice their Saturday, full Saturday, and spend a full day of listening to people like us who have that message to share. You are, by definition, intellectually curious, and you're willing to receive that particular message, and this is why you're here. So, in conclusion, TED actually takes off the three basic components of what communication is. And in doing so, TED is effective at spreading ideas.
Thank you, Radu. While I agree with most of what you're saying, the problem here is that you are neglecting the major part of any sort of communication, which is the message. And what I'm going to do in my speech is I'm going to show you how the particular format of TED Talks actually distorts the message that these particular very valuable individuals that are presenting have, and the end result will be that these particular TED Talks actually fail these speakers and fail the message that these people have due to the fact that the format is flawed. So, let's start. Let's look a bit about the restriction that TED Talks have, right? First of all, it needs to be short. It needs to be under 18 minutes, right? That means that you're going to have to shorten your lifelong research or your lifelong career into a very few bullet points, which you are then going to give to an audience exclusively, without any sort of background, without any sort of context, right? Okay. Secondly, the message needs to be digestible. Why is that so? Because there's no engagement with the audience. That means that whatever presentation you're going to make, you're going to need to make sure that everyone gets it, because you're not going to be able to clear up anything after your particular presentation, right? This also means that you're going to simplify and make your particular presentation crystal clear, right? That means that, again, you are losing on a lot of specific specialist knowledge, which might have put you in the position to be a TED speaker in the first place. And thirdly, and most importantly, what are TED Talks known for, right? They're known for being challenging. They're known for being provocative. They're known for actually making a stand on something, right? So that means that when you are invited to be a TED speaker, you're going to look for something that fits into that pattern, right? You're going to look to make a splash, which means you are already biased towards picking something that is spectacular, something that is maybe outside of the actual scope of your research or outside the scope of your field of expertise, simply because it fits better into this particular format and into the particular requirements that TED Talks have, right? So, what the mechanism here is, that because you have all these setbacks, the message loses critical information, right? Furthermore, I find it very hard to believe that, as our previous speakers have done, you can actually summarize your life's work, your life experience, into something that has a real impact in terms of having, in terms of the audience, in terms of how the audience receives it, right? So the conclusion is that because the message is distorted, even though TED fits perfectly in terms of organizing an audience, a speaker, and the way of presentation, it does have issues in terms of limiting the potential for these speakers to actually deliver a meaningful presentation rather than simply something that is sellable and something that fits into a TED Talk.
Octav, to answer your argument, fundamentally what you need to remember is that in order to bring about change, you do not need to thoroughly and fully inform your audience of every single aspect of the idea that has led to that particular message, right? Fundamentally, bringing about change, and this is what TED does secure, is it motivates people, it helps them, right? I'm going to use the simple buzzword of it inspires people. May that inspiration be, dumbed down, or share a story, or work out more based on the previous speeches that we've just heard. It always comes down to the fact that that message is something that generates a buzz and it gives a takeaway. Because the purpose of TED is not to fully inform the audience of absolutely everything that has led to the generation of the message, but rather to simply get you guys thinking, full stop. And the moment that TED does that, it does bring about change. So let's look into the argument that I originally started with, that you disagreed with. Fundamentally, I'm going to use the very link that you established in your argument, right? You start off from the assumption that the message needs to be tailored in a manner in which it will become sellable for the audience. I don't believe that that is a bad thing, because fundamentally, at the end of the day, an idea has no value on its own when it exists in a void. An idea is only as effective as it can actually be used as a rallying card, as it can be as a call to action, and it is something that is transferred to someone else. That is when you finalize that communication loop and you actually engage people to bring about that particular change. Now, the reality is that all the thought leaders in the world are not necessarily the best speakers in the world. They're just very good at what they do. May they be philosophers, may they be mathematicians, may they be whatever the profession is. Now, they do generate amazing ideas, but all of these ideas do tend to get lost if we do not focus them in a manner in which it is sellable and it is a manner that is digestible for the general public. Now, TED is great because it actually forces people to adapt their particular niche and particular specific messages in a manner in which it is generally understandable and generally digestible for this society as a whole. The moment you achieve that, you have that idea spread throughout society. And the moment you have that idea spread throughout society is when that idea is not just shared, but it is done so in a manner in which it is impactful and actually bring about change.
Okay, so let's talk about inspiration and let's talk about the actual change that TED Talks can have, right? If you dumb down an idea sufficiently enough, that means that you can always create a model in which you're right. If you don't present facts in terms of an actual debate, that means that you can always cook the books. So what you're saying makes perfect sense, but is not applicable in any way in real life. And I'm going to get back to this further down the line to show you how this is very likely to happen in these particular scenarios, right? Now, secondly, I'd also like to point out that change and the real impact also depends on logistics, also depends on if you can implement it, what are the costs of implementing that particular change, how you can achieve that change within society or within the community that you want to do it, or even within yourself, right? So, what does this mean? This means that if you remove all these particular aspects from a TED Talk, right? And the only thing that you're pitching is an idea. That means that context is irrelevant. That means that the feasibility of that particular idea or the implementation of that particular idea becomes irrelevant. Which leads me to my conclusion that TED Talks can and usually and are somehow shoehorned into the idea of entertainment, right? So they're nice ideas. They make sense when you hear them on stage. but eventually, can you actually transpose them into real life? Can you use them? We think that the particular format shifts this way more onto the side of entertainment than on actual change or an actual real impact into the lives of the audience, right? Okay, moving on to the point I was going to make on this. And here, the main point, this is very much linked with my previous rebuttal, because impact needs to be done with real understanding, right? When you can actually maneuver an idea, when you actually know how to apply it properly, or let's say that you don't have sufficient time to do that, but when you have enough engagement and enough guidelines to actually research that afterwards, rather than simply a spark that you don't know what to do in terms of a generalist audience, I think that's very accurate. I think that that particular impact is lacking. I think that the structure of the talks actually flow towards, again, entertainment, again, nice ideas, let's get out there and talk, let's see if anything sticks. But it's not built in such a way as to produce change. And it's not built in such a way as to efficiently pursue that particular change within the audience, right? And here, the real impact is lacking because, firstly, of what I just said, but secondly, there's also the very stringent problem of the overcrowding of ideas, right? Because these ideas may be good, they might actually be change-inducing, but at the same time, today, you're going to hear a lot of ideas, right? You're going to have a lot to take home. How do you pick which one is actually going to work? Well, let's see. Mostly, it's going to be the most memorable ones, which means the most shocking ones, the ones that actually make you raise an eyebrow, or the ones that you can relate to, the ones that you can, the ones that you get emotionally attached to because they either target your own field of expertise or an experience that you can relate to from your past, right? So that means that the way you, as the audience, are actually engaging with this particular TED Talks is very biased towards exactly the kind of sensationalist and spectacular speeches which will be pursued by the speakers in order to please you, the crowd. Therefore, I think that in order to decide if TED Talks actually have an impact and actually produce the change, we should see if the method and the actual mechanisms that they enforce, both on the speakers and on the audience, are prone to deliver that particular change. And I firmly believe that they are not. So now for some conclusions on this particular debate, we're going to go back to Radu.
First of all, it is the format that does not allow me to give a further response to Octav. Do not believe that he has won this debate simply because I'm no longer arguing on it. The reason we actually had the slides the way that we did, and the reason we wanted to carry out a very brief and very short version of what an actual competitive debate looks like, is because we wanted to illustrate how debate can be an effective tool in that it teaches you to, as Octav mentioned, speak in a very structured manner, right? It is meant to give you the art of persuasion through the fact that it forces you to be incredibly structured in the message that you're trying to get across, which you can see from the very graphs that we've been displaying. More importantly, it also teaches you a lot of other critical strategies. It teaches you how to make strategic concessions in that sometimes you need to accept the reality that for the purpose of the message that you're trying to get across, you will have to agree with things that aren't necessarily fully owned by you. But there is no such thing as an absolute truth, right? And this is why you would notice I would say, Octav, that's a valid point. If that would be the case, and you home down and you pick your fights in trying to persuade other people in getting the message across. But lastly, it helps you frame perspectives, because fundamentally, whenever you're trying to get a message across, we as debaters, we do not believe that there's too many things out there that cannot be proven from one perspective or another. It always comes down to the manner in which you frame it or from the perspective in which you're framing it. And this is why throughout our speeches, you could hear stuff like, this is communication, so I'm believing that they're achieving this by the virtue of what communication should be, whereas he would talk about, yes, but the message, and we need to take that perspective and look into the value of the message and whether or not it is detrimental of that structure. But the main takeaway that you fundamentally need to have after this particular demo is actually something that we misled you on at the very beginning of our speech. Because fundamentally, if you look at that graph up there, that kind of a structure is not something that debaters use to build their particular cases necessarily. It helps, it is useful, but it is not the main reason why we're taught to understand speeches in that particular manner. Fundamentally, what you were seeing there would have been the notes that, for example, I would take when Octav would be speaking against me. Fundamentally, the notes represent the manner in which a debater is taught to digest information that is thrown at him or her. Fundamentally, meaning that if you truly want to be persuasive, and if you truly want to hone in your art of persuasion, it is not the art of speaking that you need to master. Fundamentally, that is the one thing that we were taught at the early stages of debating. But we had to unlearn that very early on in carrying out debate and understand truly that fundamentally, if you do want to be persuasive, the art of speaking comes only second after you've mastered the art of carefully listening and understanding and engaging what is being thrown at you. And the moment you're able to digest and actively listen what is thrown your way, that is when you're going to be far more persuasive in convincing the people who are speaking against you. If you take this away and you engage in active listening, you will not allow Octav to win on the conclusion that fundamentally too much stuff is thrown at you, because you will actively engage with it, and this is why I will win the debate at the end of the day.